Hey Axis and Allies players, the good captain here. Welcome to video number 2 in my Axis and Allies Europe series. This video is Germany's strategic video, and in it I'll be going over what I have found to be the most competitive opener for Germany, as well as realistic mid and endgame goals. Now there is a lot to cover in this video, and though I tried as hard as I could, there's really no way to avoid this opening lecture that I have to have with regards to Germany's purchase plan and overall strategy, and I have to have this discussion before I actually push all the pieces for Germany and do the combat move. And this discussion starts with the pre-game expenditure of 12 IPCs, or the special cash advance. So I'm going to get the camera turned towards the board. We're going to have this quick discussion, then we'll get to the combat movement phase and a discussion on strategy for Germany. Okay, welcome to Axis and Allies Europe. This is the original out-of-box setup, and in accordance with the rules, the first thing that needs to happen technically before the game starts is that Germany needs to spend its special cash advance. This is not to be confused with a bid. What this is 12 IPCs allotted to each side that can be spent or saved prior to the game start. It's also sequential in that Germany must spend or save its 12 IPCs first, and then the Allies will spend or save theirs. Before I get into what I feel is the best use of these 12 IPCs for Germany, I have to state that this game appears to be significantly imbalanced in favor of the Germans. And the reason I'm saying this now is you can do any number of things with this 12 IPCs and still have a better than even chance to win the game as Germany. I've seen the addition of a submarine to the Atlantic, an extra transport to the Mediterranean. I myself was partial to adding a German fighter to France. But if you're going to spend all 12 IPCs, it appears the most efficient use of this pre-game expenditure is to add 4 infantry to Romania. This puts a lot of pressure on Ukraine, adds 4 units to the vital battle in Moscow on turn 6, and otherwise puts the most amount of pieces in a critical area of the board. However, in my playing experience, I have realized that probably the most efficient use of this 12 IPCs is to add 1 infantry to Romania and save 9. And the reason we're doing this, I'll discuss very shortly in the purchase units phase. I first have to pay some lip service to the 12 IPCs that the Allies will spend. So for now, let's get Germany straightened up here. When it comes to the best use of the Allied bid, again, I've seen multiple different variations. But a solid competitive counter would be to just add 4 infantry to Ukraine, or more conservatively to Belarusia. But again, in my playing experience, I have found the most efficient Allied bid is to place 2 infantry in Malta and 2 infantry in Ukraine. Now, for purposes of the German strategic video, when we get to the Mediterranean theater, I'm going to discuss both what to do if the British placed 2 infantry in Malta and what to do if they didn't. Otherwise, the German opener is not going to change. And again, when it comes to the Allied special cash advance, I'll discuss why we are doing what we're doing in more detail in the next video. We'll now move to the German purchase units phase and continue our discussion there. So I'm going to take this opportunity right now to discuss the entire game's purchase plan as Germany. If you go online and peruse the forums, you'll find several different purchase plans for this version of Axis and Allies. For example, one that's fairly common and seems popular is that Germany just needs to build all tanks every turn and take Moscow on turn 5 or 6 to win the game. In my playing experience, this is extraordinarily inefficient as Germany and will allow a good chance for the Allies to actually win. Instead, what I recommend is the following. For the first 2 turns, Germany builds all infantry. For turns 3 and 4, Germany builds all tanks. And for the final 2 turns, Germany builds all infantry. The first 4 turns are going to be units that are dedicated for the final fight in Moscow, whereas the last 2 turns are to help repel a Western Allies assault on Germany on turn 6. This is a guideline purchase strategy. You may have a bad opener in the Atlantic as Germany, and so you might have to buy a few fewer tanks on turn 4 and a few extra infantry, or otherwise respond to the current board state. But generally speaking, it appears that this is the most surefire way to ensure a turn 6 win as Germany. Okay, now here's the twist and the reason for this lecture before the combat move. And it hinges on the fact that the turn 2 purchase of German infantry is the last turn we can purchase units that move at 1 that can still make it to the fight in Moscow. So what this theoretically means is that we don't have to purchase the first turn worth of infantry at all. We could double that up and buy 30 infantry or thereabouts on turn 2. So if we save our IPCs on turn 1 and we know that we're going to collect at least 40 at the end of the turn, then we have a total of 89 available for a turn 2 purchase of 11 transports. 11 transports threatens a turn 3 sea lion attack. And that's the purchase I'm going to recommend. And to fully understand why we're doing this, we're going to have to wait to the end of the video where we will pick up the second half of this lecture before we close. For now, we're going to very quickly recap. We spent only 3 IPCs of the initial 12. We didn't make any purchase on turn 1. And we know that at the end of turn 1, when we collect at least 40, probably 41 or 42, that we're going to have at least 89 IPCs to spend on turn 2, in which case we can just slide right back into the purchase plan described earlier and double up on the infantry build for the fight in Moscow. I think you'll see why we don't need that first turn build by the end of this video. More detail about the sea lion attack will be covered in part 2 of this little lecture at the end of this video. Let's set all this aside and move into the combat movement phase. So what I'm going to do first is push all the pieces for the combat move. So let's start first in the Atlantic. We'll move the U-boat in the South Atlantic into the Celtic Sea. We'll move the submarine in the Azores Sea through the British convoy and into the Celtic Sea. The submarines in the Bay of Biscay will split. One will go to the Celtic Sea and the other into the English Channel. The sub in the Mid-Atlantic will go to the Davis Strait. The sub in the Halifax Sea will move through the British convoy into the Davis Strait. The sub in the Barents Sea, as well as all the German naval units in the Danish Sea, will move to the North Sea. The bomber in Germany will move to the Celtic Sea, as well as the fighter out of France. We'll go ahead and mark their remaining movement. The fighter in Norway will go into the North Sea. The fighter from Poland will go to the North Sea. The fighter in northern Italy will go into the English Channel. The fighters in Germany will split. One will go to the North Sea and one will go to the English Channel. In the Mediterranean, 1 infantry will load off of northern Italy, and the Italian fleet will head to the Strait of Gibraltar. And there they will offload the infantry into Gibraltar. And pending the naval battle, this territory will go to Germany. Almost forgot one out here in the Atlantic. This submarine in the Denmark Strait goes to the Davis Strait. Okay, now out on the east front, from top to bottom, these 3 infantry will hit Viborg. 4 out of the 6 infantry will hit the Baltic States. We'll also send 1 armor out of Germany into the Baltic States and 1 artillery from Poland. Next, we'll move 2 infantry from Poland and 3 infantry from Hungary into East Poland. We'll support them by moving the artillery from Hungary into East Poland, as well as the other armor from Germany. Finally, we'll send 3 infantry from Romania into Bessarabia, as well as the armor from Romania. Okay, this concludes the combat movement portion of the turn. Let's go into each segment and discuss what's going on. We'll start first with the East Front and Operation Barbarossa. So when it comes to the German opener out here on the East Front, I feel the goal is fairly straightforward. We want to remove these 9 Russian infantries from the board and single armor unit. And to that end, I'll go ahead and post the percentages for each of these battles in terms of win-loss and draw. And as you can see, these are very healthy percentages. Attentive players may notice that I didn't commit all the German assets. I left 3 armor and an infantry behind that could have been committed, so I'll just say right now, if you don't like these percentages and want to tune them up further, you can using these pieces. The reason I recommend not doing that has to do with how the Russian player should be playing Russia, and I'm just going to have to wait until the Russian strategic video to go into detail about that. Suffice to say, the Russian player, especially on the first turn, should be looking for as many strafe opportunities as he can. So as the German player, committing only 1 armor in each of these territories is, in my experience, the best way to mitigate losses from potential Russian strafing counterattacks. But again, we'll cover that in more detail in the Russian strategic video. So I'm going to go ahead now and resolve the battles to their most likely outcomes according to the battle calculator. So in Vyborg, we'll say the Germans lose 1 piece. In the Baltic states, we'll say the Germans lose 2 infantry. In East Poland, we'll say the Germans lose 2 infantry. And in Bessarabia, we'll say the Germans lose 1 infantry. So most of the time we'll end up looking something like this at the end of G1 on the Eastern Front. We'll talk more about mid and long range strategies in the non-combat movement segment of this video. I'll just put one final note on these battles out here on the Eastern Front on turn 1. I like to resolve Vyborg and Bessarabia first, only because East Poland and Baltic states could be potential strafes. For example, in East Poland, if the Germans eliminate 3 Russian infantry and suffer no loss, I'm going to have a good long think about whether to pull those units out of East Poland and not leave them open to Russian counterattack. Conversely, if for some reason I feel that one territory needs to be bulked up, I can always, in the non-combat movement phase, move in more assets and reinforce. That's it for this theater. Let's move over to the Atlantic. When it comes to the Battle of the Atlantic, I feel that the best German opener out here is to strike a balance between disrupting convoys and destroying Allied naval assets. And in this situation, we've knocked off both the British convoys at 5 IPCs, and we're going to engage in several major naval battles that have very healthy percentages as the German player. I'll go ahead and post the percentages on the screen so you can see them. And in this case, I would actually sequence the battles and start with either the Celtic Sea or North Sea first. The reason I would do this is these 2 battles are pretty foregone in terms of their conclusions, but I like to see what's left after the battles for Germany in order to determine how hard I should go in these 2 battles where things are slightly less certain. For example, if I completely whiff the first round of combat in the English Channel and the British player knocks off my U-boat, I want to be the best informed I can be when deciding if I should risk a second round of combat and exposing one of my air units to destruction. Understanding the results of the Celtic Sea and North Sea fights will help inform me of how much I really need to knock off that destroyer or not. For example, if all my U-boats are destroyed, there's no real reason for me to risk an air unit to knock off this British destroyer. Conversely, if most of my U-boats are still alive and there's very little threat except for this British destroyer and its ability to call in the British Air Force against one of my fleets, then yeah, I would go in for a second round of combat and risk losing a fighter. So again, I'll just punch up the most likely outcomes for the Celtic Sea and the North Sea. So in the Celtic Sea, it's most likely that there will be 4 pieces remaining. In other words, we'll just lose 1 submarine. But if we lose a second, we really shouldn't be surprised. And the same is true for the North Sea. We should have 5 pieces remaining, and I recommend losing a sub and a transport. One thing to point out here is that the British order of loss after the battleship takes its first hit is likely to be the transport, then the battleship, and then the destroyer. And the reason for this is if you try to keep the battleship alive as the British player, the submarines will be allowed their first strike in subsequent rounds of combat when the destroyer is not present. So keep an eye out for that. So again, this is the most likely outcome for both the North Sea and Celtic Sea. However, if one or both of these sea zones only have 1 or even no boats left, we shouldn't be surprised as the German player. In this situation, I would do the fight in the Davis Strait next. This one has the lowest percentage odds in favor of Germany, and the most likely outcome is that there are 2 German U-boats left. Having played this game enough times to know that this can go badly for the Germans, in a situation where that British destroyer survives, I would fight until there's one boat left. And as a German player, if there's only one U-boat left and the British destroyer is still alive, I will submerge the German submarine and create a hostile sea zone here. We'll discuss more about submerging German submarines in the non-combat segment of this video. I just want to flag that fact while I'm here. Finally, we fight the battle in the English Channel, and the most likely result here is that the German submarine and British destroyer are both eliminated. Let's now cover what's going on down in Africa and the Mediterranean. This particular opener is fairly simple. There's something like a 0.5% chance that the British destroyer actually picks up a kill beyond just damaging the battleship. Otherwise, Gibraltar will fall and this destroyer will be knocked out. But not every Allied opponent is going to put 2 British units on the island of Malta. So in the case where they may have just added 2 more infantry to the east front, here's how I would do things differently in the Mediterranean. In this case, I load an infantry and artillery onto the transport, bring the battleship, and that will usually dispose of the British fighter, as you can see. And we still need to make an effort to destroy this British destroyer, so I commit the German destroyer here and pull the fighter out of the English Channel, one had only one movement, and deploy him here instead. One minor fix here, I don't take an infantry from northern Italy, I take it from southern Italy. The end result is typically a loss of a German infantry and the British fighter in Malta. The most likely outcome is the destruction of both destroyers in the Strait of Gibraltar. I'll cover several what-if scenarios with regards to surviving UK destroyers momentarily. Let's first do the non-combat movement phase to get the board state into a post-non-combat movement position so we're best able to discuss mid and end game goals. Okay, for the non-combat movement phase, I move the armor in Hungary to Poland. I move the infantry and artillery in Czechoslovakia to Poland. I move the infantry in Austria to Hungary, and the artillery in Austria to Czechoslovakia. We're going to move the infantry in Romania to Hungary, as well as both infantry in Yugoslavia. Everything in Greece will move into Yugoslavia. 1 infantry from Bulgaria will move to Yugoslavia, and the other infantry will move to Romania to act as a blocker. The armor in northern Italy will move to Hungary. The infantry in northern Italy will move to Yugoslavia. The artillery in northern Italy will move to Austria. And there's a reason that we're keeping these artillery adjacent to Germany. We'll go into the reason why we're doing that in the second part of the Sea Lion lecture at the end of this video. The 2 infantry in southern Italy move to northern Italy. The 2 armor in France move to northern Italy. Everything in Germany moves to Poland. The infantry in Denmark moves to Germany. The infantry in the Netherlands move to Germany, as does everything in eastern France. The armor in the Netherlands moves to Poland. The pieces remaining in France move to the Netherlands, Belgium. Up in Norway, we're going to leave 2 infantry in place and bring the other 2 forward into Finland. Down in Africa, we're going to consolidate every German piece into Algeria here. That leaves the air units, and we're going to move the bomber to Germany. The fighter in the Celtic Sea will move to Netherlands, Belgium. The fighter with only 1 movement in the Channel will move to Netherlands, Belgium. The fighter with only 1 movement in the North Sea will move to Norway. And of the 3 remaining fighters, 1 is going to go to Norway, and the other 2 will fly into Germany. Okay, this is a really chaotic board, so let's go ahead and get it cleaned up and chipped up. Okay, that's much better, and I realize I forgot one piece. I like to move the AA gun in northern Italy to Austria as well. Okay, with that all out of the way, let's go through each segment again. And this time, we're going to talk about mid and end game goals, keeping in mind that everything is rigged to end on turn 6. Out on the east front on the Russian turn 1, we can expect one or more territories to be attacked and possibly strafed. We'll discuss that in more detail in the Russian strategic video. For turns 2, 3, and 4, what the German player wants to focus on is removing Russian pieces. Whether this means engaging in strafe opportunities or otherwise making sensible attacks, the German player should not feel a ton of pressure to drive forward as hard as he can into the heartland of Russia. The main thing to keep in mind for the mid-game goal is that it's extremely likely that there's going to be a large turn 2 build of infantry, which will be in Poland on turn 3, in East Poland or the Baltic states on turn 4, and then in Belarusia on turn 5. Everything that happens until that point can and should be more or less inconsequential. So long as the German player doesn't give the Russian player a huge opportunity and lose most of his forces, we expect to be in Belarusia on turn 5 for the killing blow on turn 6. When it comes to the northern front up here in Finland and Norway, if the Allied powers haven't knocked out these pieces, they need to be moving forward into Karelia or Leningrad by turn 4 to be adjacent to Moscow on turn 5 for the big assault on turn 6. One final note, that turn 4 purchase of German armor will be in East Poland by itself on turn 5, where the main body of the German army will be in Belarusia, but the entire group in those two territories will hit Moscow on turn 6. If done correctly, even against really good Allied play, we're looking at probably something in the ballpark of 95% success. If you come up with a percentage less than that, there was probably some inefficiency on the side of the German player, or extremely bad luck. Let's now move to the Atlantic. When it comes to the Atlantic, the German player will likely have 5 or 6 boats remaining out here. If you have more than that, then you were lucky. If you have less than that, you were unlucky. And in my opinion, this area of the battlefield is probably more important than what's happening on the Eastern Front. And the reason I say that is that if the German player has a particularly cold opener and the U-boat threat is mopped up at the end of G1 or G2, then the Western Allied attack on Germany will be far more potent and will necessarily take away from assets to be used in the battle on Moscow. So as the German player, we're very interested in prolonging this fight for as long as possible. And this is where I'm going to cite at least 2 rules of naval combat that I feel weren't fully appreciated at the time that this game was released. And the first is to note that in this game, submarines never lose the ability to submerge. The presence of a destroyer does not remove the ability of a submarine to submerge. Now, combined with this, there's another subtle rule, and that is that if attacked, in lieu of returning fire, the German submarine can submerge instead. What these 2 rules together translate to is the following. Anytime an Allied player attacks German submarines, the Allies get 1 round of combat and then it's over. So to just take this case as an example, if the Americans attacked this group of submarines on their turn and scored 1 hit, the German player can and should return fire with the submarine that was hit and submerge instead of returning fire with the submarine that was not. This would end the combat, and at the end of the turn, the submarine would resurface and create a hostile sea zone, which is the 3rd and final rule to cite with regards to submarines and this game. Submarines create hostile sea zones. So in the case of this battle, the air units fly away, and unless the British are able to remove this submarine on their next turn, this American transport will not be allowed to load on its turn. These rules can also be used to the German player's benefit on the German turn. Just to take another example, if a German submarine in the Davis Strait moves into the US eastern coast, it can forgo combat and submerge. It would then resurface at the end of its turn, creating a hostile sea zone, and again, unless the British were able to remove this submarine, this transport would not be able to load on its turn. This particular use of the submarine, used in this way, actually had a name back in the day. It was called substalling. So it behooves a German player not just to know the rules of naval combat, but their application. So the mid and end game goal for Germany in the Atlantic is the following. Survive for as long as possible and be something more than a nuisance out here in the Atlantic by substalling when you see the opportunity, by raiding convoys, by making the British and Americans spend precious IPCs on more naval units, and just making it as hard and miserable as possible for them to make a robust turn 6 attack on Germany. Now, to anyone who is surprised by these submarine rules and their application, and wondering how the Allies could possibly combat this, fear not, there are several naval rules that benefit the Allies, and we'll go over those and Allied naval counterplay in the video that covers the British and Americans. One thing to mention before leaving the Atlantic, we have 2 fighters in the Netherlands and 2 fighters in Norway, set specifically to cover the Atlantic Sea Zone and the Celtic Sea Zone. The purpose for this is to make it very difficult for the British and Americans to form up effectively in the Atlantic on the first turn. So each of these zones can be hit by whatever U-boats are still alive out here, plus at least 2 fighters and a bomber from the European continent. Okay, let's now move down to Africa. So in this area of the board, if the Allied player placed 2 infantry in Malta and your board looks like this, it's pretty obvious at this point the Germans have ceded this front to the Allies to go after bigger game elsewhere. Or so it would seem. There's a couple of mid-game options available down here. The first is, of course, that we can turn right back around with the Italian fleet and move back towards the Middle East and threaten this area of the board. The other is that we can break out with the Italian fleet into the Atlantic and, as we'll soon discuss, support the Operation Sea Lion, if we as the German player decide to go down that route. If Sea Lion is not in play, as it won't be in most games if you're playing a competent Allied player, I pick up and turn right back around and head into operations on the Eastern Mediterranean area. No matter what happens, this front is typically a backwater, and if there's going to be a breakthrough in the Middle East, it typically happens on the Eastern Front through Ukraine and the Caucasus anyway, so the goal here is to just move east and destroy British pieces at our convenience. Keeping in mind this game ends on turn 6, there's not a lot of consequential fighting that goes on down here. I will say that if the Germans do catch a break and rip into the Middle East, the net effect of this is that the money comes out of the USA IPCs, and this translates to a softer attack on Germany at the end of the game. In other words, the Western Allied attack on Germany is going to be more anemic. I'll now briefly discuss what to do if the Allied player did not place 2 infantry in Malta. So let me go ahead and reconfigure the board for that situation. So in the case where the British leave the fighter on Malta unprotected, what I like to do in the non-combat movement phase is move the infantry in Morocco into Algeria, and then on German turn 2, 3, and 4, slowly work your way forward into the Eastern Mediterranean, eventually most likely to break through into at least Egypt and Palestine before the end of the game. One thing I would recommend not doing is pulling off any troops with this transport that are heading towards Moscow. Just use the Luftwaffe and the pieces in this area of the board, including this infantry on Crete, to grind down the British and break into the oil-rich territories of the Middle East. But I just want to re-emphasize one last time, this area of the board is not critical. At the very least, the Germans should be interested in destroying this British fleet, but even that's not absolutely critical. We're now coming to the end of this strategic video. We don't have any units to place, and we'll be collecting 42 IPCs. So we'll have a total of 91 going into next turn. What we are going to do now is close our discussion on Operation Sea Lion and then do a quick recap and then close this video. This second part of the lecture regarding Sea Lion is going to be focused on the logistics for Germany if we decided to go ahead with the invasion. Whether or not to pull the trigger on Operation Sea Lion cannot be determined by the German player until the beginning of Germany turn 2. The reason for this is that we need to observe both what the Allies do on their first turns and how effective it is before we can make that final assessment. We're going to have to wait till the Western Allies strategy video to cover this final and critical component of this strategy. But in general, and in the fewest amount of words, if the Allied players do not pay in any way what's known in the Axis and Allies community as the Sea Lion tax, and if there's in the ballpark of a 90 to 95% chance of success, then if I'm the German player, I'm going to conduct the invasion. Now, whatever happens in terms of the combat and non-combat on Germany turn 2, the purchase is of course the 11 transports. And if you'll remember at the end of G1, we kept the artillery adjacent to Germany, and this is for a very specific reason. That's so we move them all into Germany in preparation for the invasion on Germany turn 3. This gives us 6 artillery in Germany. This leaves space for 16 infantry. We have 8 on Germany and 4 in the Netherlands, so we'll have to pull 4 more off of Poland to complete the entire invasion fleet. Also on G2, we have the Italian fleet with access to yet another artillery and infantry, so we'll load the artillery from Algeria and infantry from Gibraltar. and likely bring the fleet up to the Bay of Biscay. Finally, you want to make sure that your entire Luftwaffe is available for the invasion. So displacing your fighters so that they're in range to do battle is also critical. There is some flexibility in how this is managed as the German player. For example, you could save all 12 of the IPCs of the Special Cash Advance, and therefore end up with something like 94 IPCs, and buy a destroyer instead of an 11th transport. So depending on many factors, which we'll go over in the Allied Strategic video, against experienced Allied play, we're likely not going to be conducting this invasion. But here's why I feel strongly that you should always threaten Operation Sea Lion as Germany in Axis and Allies Europe. The main goal is to confound the British player and make them either play inefficiently by forcing them to save all their IPCs to see what Germany does on Germany turn 2, foul their purchase by buying things they otherwise wouldn't or shouldn't buy, and otherwise put a ton of pressure on that player right out of the gate. So although we're not quite done talking about this strategy, and you're going to hear about it again in a future video in this series, the intent here is to have listeners sort of follow along and see the thing developed. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and reset the board to the end of G1 board state. Okay, and we're now in a good position to recap and then close this video. This was the Germany strategic video for Axis and Allies Europe. I opened with a discussion around the purchase plan for Germany and why I feel it's viable to save for Operation Sea Lion on G1 instead of making any purchases. We then went through what I feel is the best opener in regards to the combat moves, went through each theater of the board to discuss how and why we made the moves that we made. After that, we went through the non-combat movement phase, before closing with a brief update on when to decide to pull the trigger on Operation Sea Lion or not, and the logistics necessary to maneuver into that position for the G3 assault. And though that's it for this video, I do feel that to fully comprehend the best strategy for Germany, you also need to watch the Russian strategic video as well as the Western Power strategic video in this series. So I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching this, all the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.